In late May of 1940, the war in France stopped behaving like the war everyone had rehearsed in their heads. It didn't look like tidy lines on a map anymore. It looked like roads clogged with carts and trucks, like units mixed together in a moving storm of exhausted men, like fields cut open by bombs that landed without warning and left craters full of muddy water. It sounded like engines and sirens and distant artillery that never quite went quiet. It smelled like diesel, wet wool, smoke, and that sharp metallic bite that hangs in the air after gunfire. And it felt, above all else, like time was collapsing, like every hour that passed was paid for with something you could never get back. Somewhere near the village of L'Épinette in northern France, a British officer crouched behind rough stone watching a thin veil of morning mist drift across hedgerows. He wasn't famous yet. He wasn't a symbol. He was just one officer in a retreat that had become so frantic it blurred into a kind of collective panic. His name was Jack Churchill, John Malcolm Thorpe, Fleming Churchill, if you want the full weight of it, but history would later hang another name on him: Mad Jack. The nickname would make him sound like a joke. The truth is darker. It's not that he didn't understand the war, it's that he understood one part of it so well he was willing to look insane to everyone else. Because beside him, in a war of tanks and machine guns, was a longbow. A real one. 6 feet of wood and string. A weapon that belonged to ballads and castles and museum cases. Not to a modern battlefield where aircraft hunted roads and armored columns chewed through defenses. And yet there it was, carried into the mud of 1940 as calmly as another officer might carry a map case. Most of the men around him carried rifles and fear. Churchill carried those too, in his own way. But he also carried something older, a refusal to accept that the only weapons worth bringing to war were the ones that made the biggest noise. The accounts that survive, some told as fact, some repeated as legend, say a small German patrol came forward through the mist, careful, scanning. 5 men. Not a platoon, not a spearhead, just a handful of soldiers moving like professionals who had learned what an ambush looked like. The lead man, a sergeant in some tellings, checked the obvious threats. The line of the hedge, the dark squares of windows, the angles of walls where a rifle barrel might appear. He was searching for a flash, a crack, a burst. He was trained for the modern war. He had a shape in his mind for how he might die. He did not have a shape for what happened next. If the famous story is true, and even if it's partly myth, it still reveals the psychology of that moment. Churchill waited until they were close. Close enough that he could see the damp on their uniforms, the way their shoulders tightened as they moved through uncertainty, the way the lead man's head turned in short, practiced movements. Then Churchill drew the bow. Not like a novice yanking on string, but like a man whose body already knows where the draw ends and where the shot lives. Archers talk about anchor points, about the feel of the string at the corner of the mouth or the cheek. They talk about the mind becoming still. They talk about not thinking, because thinking is how you miss. He released. No gunshot, no muzzle flash, no loud declaration to the world, just a quick, quiet motion, and then an arrow crossing a few dozen yards of cold air. If you've never seen an arrow fly, you might imagine it slow. It's not. In close range, it is shockingly fast. It arrives like a sudden decision. The lead German went down. And that is where the real weapon appears, even more than the arrow itself. The pause in the minds of the men behind him. Because what do you do in the first half second after a man collapses without sound? Your instincts search for the familiar. You want the crack of a rifle to tell you where to look. You want the chatter of a machine gun so you can dive and crawl. You want something that makes sense. But an arrow doesn't announce itself the way a bullet does. It doesn't leave the same sound. It arrives like a quiet violation of expectations. And in that violation is the kind of psychological shock that turns trained soldiers into confused human beings for just long enough to matter. One heartbeat, one breath, one moment of, what in God's name? And in war, especially at close distance, a single moment of hesitation can be fatal. Now here is the honest part. This longbow kill is famous, but it's also disputed. Churchill himself, later in life, made remarks that imply his bow was damaged early in the campaign, crushed by a vehicle in some retellings, which raises questions about how confirmed the arrow kill truly is. Some historians treat it as legend that grew because it is too perfect to forget. Others treat it as plausible, because Churchill really did carry a bow and because the chaos of 1940 is exactly the kind of chaos where improbable things happen and are remembered unevenly. But whether it was a documented kill or an embroidered memory, the scene captures a truth that doesn't need perfect certainty. The retreat was so unreal that reality itself felt unstable. People were doing the unthinkable just to survive. Men were dying in ways no manual prepared anyone for. And the mind, when it's cornered, reaches for any advantage it can find, even if that advantage is centuries old. The Germans in May of 1940 were not just winning. They were breaking assumptions. Poland had fallen fast. Now France was being ripped apart by speed, coordination, and the terrifying confidence of an army that believed the future belonged to it. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was being driven backward toward the sea. The retreat wasn't a strategic withdrawal so much as a race against encirclement. Roads became arteries carrying fear. Bridges became bottlenecks where men waited to die. Stretches of open ground became killing fields whenever aircraft appeared. This is one of the first brutal lessons of that summer. In modern war, danger comes from above as often as from ahead. A man can be marching, thinking only of the next village, and suddenly the sky opens and becomes a weapon. Bombs don't care if you're brave. Machine gun strafing doesn't care if you're loved. It's geometry and timing and luck. That's why the retreat felt like a roulette wheel. Men counted time not in hours, but in gaps between attacks. 10 minutes of quiet, 20 minutes of quiet, then suddenly the howl of aircraft and everyone diving into ditches like animals. Officers burned papers by the roadside because those papers were now dead weight. Men buried equipment they couldn't carry, as if hiding it in the earth might preserve their dignity. Some soldiers threw away rifles. Not because they wanted to, but because they were running for their lives, and every extra pound felt like a hand on the throat. And then came the coast. Dunkirk. A name that sounds clean when you say it quickly, but was anything but clean. The beaches became waiting rooms where men stood in long lines that barely moved. The sea was cold. The wind blew sand into eyes already raw from smoke. Ships came and went under fire. When bombs hit, the beach erupted. Sand, bodies, splinters. Then the survivors stood up and reformed the line because the alternative was to sit down and die. Between late May and early June, hundreds of thousands were evacuated in an operation that felt like a miracle made from small boats, naval discipline, and a kind of national stubbornness. But miracles have costs. The army that returned to Britain came back alive. Yes, but stripped of weapons and vehicles and the easy confidence that they understood the war. They returned expecting invasion. They returned exhausted. They returned carrying the memory of friends who never reached the waterline. Jack Churchill returned too. And in the stories told afterward, he returned with his strange arsenal intact. Bow, sword, bagpipes, items that looked like theater until you understood he treated them as a different kind of warfare. Not a replacement for bullets, not a denial of modern reality. A tool for the oldest part of combat. Fear. To understand why Churchill is remembered at all, you have to understand what kind of man willingly swims against the current of his own era. He trained as an officer in a system that prized convention. He learned the expected language of military discipline. He served abroad, absorbed a lifetime of soldiering that should have made him a tidy, predictable professional. And then he did something that often gets overlooked in the madman legend. He got bored. Peace felt like suffocation. Routine felt like death. Some men crave safety. Others crave intensity the way a drowning man craves air. Before the war, Churchill lived a life that seemed to collect strange skills the way other men collect paychecks. He learned to play the bagpipes. He competed as an archer at a serious level. He cultivated a physical toughness that made hardship feel normal. He was the kind of person who treated discomfort as entertainment. That doesn't mean he didn't feel fear. It means he didn't allow fear to decide what he did. When war came, Churchill didn't rejoin the army to become a desk officer. He rejoined as a man who had decided something about himself, that if he was going to risk death, he would do it in a way that was unmistakably his. There is a line often attributed to him. Some say he said it. Some say it's the kind of thing people put into his mouth because it sounds like him, about an officer being improperly dressed for battle without a sword. Whether he said it exactly or not, the attitude is real. He believed in the shock value of the unexpected. He believed war was not only about hardware, it was about the human brain under pressure. That belief becomes crucial after Dunkirk, when Britain needs to prove it can strike back. Desperation is a powerful inventor. Out of that desperation came the Commandos, raiding units designed to hit occupied territory hard and vanish before the enemy could react. These were not polite soldiers. They were volunteers for missions that everyone understood might not offer a return ticket, and their training was built to be as unforgiving as the missions. Long marches with heavy packs, amphibious landings in freezing water that turned hands numb and made weapon handling clumsy. Exercises with live fire snapping overhead, designed to teach men not to panic when death sounds close. Techniques for silent killing. Techniques for moving in darkness. Techniques for acting fast when your heart is racing and your mouth tastes like metal. The men who couldn't keep up were sent back. Not because they were weak in life, because they weren't suited to this particular kind of war. Churchill thrived. And here is the point many people miss. He wasn't carrying medieval weapons because he thought they were better than firearms. He carried them because they created a psychological effect firearms could not. A rifle is expected. A rifle makes sense. A rifle is familiar even to the enemy. But a sword in close combat changes the emotional temperature of a fight. It makes it personal in a way bullets often don't. It tells the enemy you are willing to step into their fear radius. It tells them the fight is happening at a distance where there's no time to plan. And bagpipes. Bagpipes are not stealth. Bagpipes are the opposite of stealth, but in certain moments, that's the point. Bagpipes turn a raid into a statement. They tell your men, "We are here," and they tell the enemy, "Your world is about to break." They are a weapon aimed at the human mind's need for normality. By late 1941, Churchill is with Commando forces heading into one of the most famous raids of the war, Operation Archery on the Norwegian coast. Norway in winter is not just cold, it's a cold that reshapes the body. Metal stings skin, water is a threat, the air bites lungs, the sea is black, and the shoreline, occupied by German forces, waits with prepared positions, coastal guns, machine guns, and all the hardware that should make any amphibious landing feel like suicide. The plan of a raid looks clean on paper. Timetables, objectives, landing points, withdrawal schedules. But raids in practice are controlled chaos, men climbing down nets into landing craft while ships pound targets ashore. Smoke screens trying to blind defenders, aircraft buzzing overhead, radios crackling with partial messages, every face tense because everyone understands. If this goes wrong, you don't just lose men, you lose the ability to get them home. A raid is a fight where the exit is part of the battlefield. Accounts commonly describe Churchill stepping into the first wave with bagpipes, music cutting through artillery thunder and the crunch of boots on rock. Whether every detail is as dramatic as later retellings, the underlying truth remains. The raid succeeded largely because it hit fast, hard, and with a violence that stole time from defenders. Fortifications are built on time. They assume you will approach cautiously. They assume you will hesitate. They assume you will allow their guns to settle into a rhythm. A raid breaks rhythm. In close combat, rhythm is everything. The first seconds decide whether defenders become coordinated killers or confused men grabbing for weapons. The first seconds decide whether attackers become a wave or a scattered handful of targets. The fighting at close quarters is never clean. It is not movie choreography. It is noise, smoke, shouted commands, boots slipping on wet stone, the smell of explosives and burning fuel, the sound of someone screaming for a medic and another man trying to drag him while bullets snap nearby. It is pushing into doorways that might hide an automatic weapon. It is clearing positions where you don't have time to be philosophical. It is the terrifying simplicity of move or die. The raid inflicted real damage and took prisoners and seized intelligence. It also paid in blood. You can summarize the cost with numbers. Killed, wounded, enemy captured, but numbers are polite. Numbers don't show the way a man's hands shake after a firefight, even if he tries to hide it. Numbers don't show the look a soldier gives the sea when he realizes he has to run back to a boat under fire. Numbers don't show the moment a young commando stares at the body of someone who was joking with him an hour earlier and feels something inside him go quiet. War is not only danger. It is also the slow erosion of the part of you that believes the world is stable. Operation Archery became proof that special forces could strike hard and force the enemy to respond. Proof that small units could create outsized effects by choosing where and when to hit. And it fed the Churchill myth because it matched the logic of his approach. Psychological shock, aggression, unpredictability. You don't have to defeat the enemy's weapons first if you can defeat their certainty. But for all the romance that stories like to build around him, pipes and sword and daring, Churchill's war, like everyone else's, also included the grinding misery that doesn't make good legends. Campaigns in Sicily and Italy dragged men through heat and dust and rubble, through villages that turned into fortresses, through hills that became artillery magnets. Italy had a strange cruelty. It could look beautiful even while killing you. Sunlight on olive groves, mountains glowing at dusk, and then a shell landing and turning a doorway into a wound in the earth. Here, war becomes less about bold raids and more about endurance. Holding positions, moving at night, fighting for roads that matter because supply lines are the real bloodstream of armies. The same fear appears, but it changes shape. Less sudden shock and more constant pressure. Sleep becomes something you borrow in short fragments. You sleep in your boots. You wake to explosions. You taste grit in your teeth. You learn to function while exhausted because the enemy doesn't pause so you can recover. It's in this environment that one of the most famous sword stories is told. Churchill capturing a large group of German soldiers, often cited as 42, in a night action near Melina. The exact details vary depending on which version you hear, but the shape of the story is consistent and reveals the psychological pattern again. A strong point needs to be neutralized. A frontal assault would be costly. Churchill chooses stealth and audacity. He moves with a tiny team, uses darkness, appears suddenly where the enemy expects emptiness, and demands surrender with a calm authority that doesn't match the insanity of the situation. Groups of soldiers surrender not because they are cowards, but because their brains are trying to catch up. They cannot reconcile what is happening quickly enough to resist. It's the same half-second of hesitation, expanded into minutes, because the situation is so unnatural that it short-circuits expectation. The prisoners are marched back at dawn, some wounded moved with improvised carts, and Churchill reportedly remarked that it looked like something out of an older war. Napoleonic, not modern, because once again, the 20th century had been forced to wear a face from the past. Whether Churchill used exactly those words or not, the image stands. Modern troops in modern uniforms being led by a man with a blade, as if time had cracked open and spilled. He was decorated for courage. He became a story that traveled faster than paperwork. Stories spread because soldiers need them. In a war that reduces individuals to numbers, A vivid character becomes a proof that individuality can survive. A soldier hearing about Mad Jack could believe for a moment that war was not only a machine grinding men into paste. It was still a place where a person could bend reality through willpower. But then the war takes its payment. By 1944, Churchill is involved in operations in Yugoslavia, another theater where the war is savage in a different way. Here it is not only battles, it is occupation, resistance, reprisals, villages punished, fighters melting into mountains. A landscape where the rules are less formal and mercy is harder to find. The enemy is not always the man in front of you. Sometimes it is hunger, exhaustion, betrayal, and the simple fact that anyone with a gun can decide you are an enemy. On the island of Brach, the story turns. Plans falter, coordination breaks, mortars find range. Men fall. And in one of the most haunting legends attached to Churchill, he ends up isolated, alone or nearly alone, while German forces close in. The story says he sits and plays a lament on the bagpipes as a final act of defiance. Whether the exact tune is correctly remembered is less important than what the image represents. A man refusing to beg, refusing to panic, refusing to allow fear to own his last moments. Then a blast, often described as a grenade, knocks him unconscious. He wakes up captured. There is a particular kind of terror in capture that battlefield fear doesn't prepare you for. In combat, fear is mixed with agency. You can move, you can shoot, you can run, you can choose. In capture, fear becomes pure vulnerability. Your life is now in the hands of men who may not care if you live. You're stripped of control. You're forced into waiting, and waiting in war is often the most brutal weapon of all. Churchill is interrogated. The Germans are interested in his name because Churchill carries political weight, even if Jack has no direct connection to the Prime Minister. They hope for secrets he doesn't have. He gives them nothing useful. He is sent into the system that consumes prisoners not with bullets, but with time. He ends up in Sachsenhausen, associated with political prisoners and prominent detainees. Life in such places is a different kind of battlefield. Hunger, cold, monotony, and the constant threat of punishment. Days blur. The body weakens. People around you lose hope in quiet increments. The camp is designed to turn human beings into compliant shadows. It uses routine as a hammer. It uses time as torture. For many men, survival meant becoming small and invisible, not drawing attention, not resisting. Churchill doesn't function that way. He studies the camp like he would study an objective map. Guard routines, fence lines, who looks bored, who looks eager to punish, how long it takes a patrol to pass a certain corner, where noise is masked by other noise. He searches for weakness not because he is fearless, but because he cannot tolerate the idea of simply waiting for someone else to decide his fate. Escape becomes his second war. A tunnel is dug, slowly, secretly, with whatever tools can be stolen or improvised. Dirt is hidden. Work is done at night. Men risk everything for inches of progress. It's a strange thing to imagine. The same officer who stormed beaches now clawing through earth like an animal because that is what freedom demands. In late 1944, the escape attempt succeeds. Churchill and others slip out through darkness and into a Germany still filled with patrols, checkpoints, and suspicion. The outside world is not freedom yet. It is danger with different rules. They move mostly at night, hide by day, steal food when they can, drink from streams, avoid roads. Cold returns, not the dramatic cold of a battlefield, but the quiet cold that seeps into joints and makes you feel old. Hunger becomes a constant ache. Every sound becomes a threat. And then, after days of movement, after hope has begun to inflate again, they are caught. Recapture is crushing because it teaches a cruel lesson. You can do everything right and still lose. The war doesn't owe you a reward for bravery. It only owes you consequences. Churchill is moved again. The war is collapsing now. Germany is under pressure from multiple fronts. Cities burn, bombers pass overhead. Guards grow nervous, orders become inconsistent. The system begins to fracture. In the chaos of 1945, prisoners are transported through mountains, sometimes treated like bargaining chips, sometimes treated like burdens. There are moments, documented in various accounts, where regular German army units and SS units clash over what to do with prisoners, where authority is uncertain, where the usual cruelty is interrupted by the simple fact that no one knows what the end will look like. In that collapsing world, Churchill survives. Some versions of the story describe him simply walking out amid confusion and heading toward Allied lines, injured and exhausted, because he cannot sit still and wait for liberation. Whether it was a dramatic escape or a stubborn walk, the image is powerful. A man reduced to ragged clothing and sheer will, choosing movement as survival. After nearly a year of capture, the body is not the same. Hunger leaves marks. Cold leaves marks. The mind carries its own scars. Yet Churchill makes it back to friendly forces, and then back into the machinery of Allied control, and eventually back home. The war in Europe is ending. The concentration camps are being liberated. The scale of atrocity becomes undeniable. The world begins to understand what had been happening behind fences and watchtowers. The war has not only killed soldiers, it has poisoned the concept of civilization itself. And still, Churchill asks to go fight again. There is something unsettling about that, and it's worth not romanticizing. Some men emerge from war desperate for quiet. Others emerge restless, as if peace is an empty room and war is the only place that feels real. Churchill reportedly sought transfer to the Far East because Japan was still fighting. Then the war ended suddenly. Atomic bombs, surrender, and the final invasion he might have imagined never came. There are stories of him reacting with bitter disappointment, even making a dark joke about how long the war might have continued without that ending. Whether he said it exactly or not, the sentiment fits a personality shaped by danger, a man who found meaning when death was close. But the post-war years also reveal another side of him that doesn't fit the medieval berserker image. In Palestine, during Britain's withdrawal and the violent chaos around Jerusalem, Churchill is associated with helping organize the evacuation of hundreds of medical staff and patients from Mount Scopus. This is not sword and pipes drama. This is negotiation and logistics and calm authority in a situation where fear and anger could ignite into massacre. It shows that his understanding of psychology was not only about terrifying enemies. It was also about reassuring allies, about projecting composure so others could breathe. Eventually, the war recedes into memory, and Churchill becomes what all veterans become: a person forced to live in a world that has moved on. Technology changes, empires shrink. The type of war he fought becomes history. The man who carried a sword into battle ends up navigating civilian life with the same odd stubbornness that carried him through combat. Stories accumulate. Eccentric habits, strange hobbies, moments that sound like fiction, because the human mind likes to build coherence by turning extraordinary lives into a series of anecdotes. It is easier to laugh at Mad Jack than to stare too long at what he actually lived through. Terror, loss, captivity, hunger, and the knowledge that death can arrive without warning. When he dies, decades later, the gap between the old man and the young commando is almost impossible to bridge. That is the final cruelty of war stories. They turn into entertainment unless you force yourself to feel the weight behind them. A longbow kill becomes a fun trivia fact. Bagpipes on a Norwegian beach becomes a cinematic image. 42 prisoners captured becomes a punchline. But beneath all of it is a truth that should never feel comfortable. War is a machine that consumes human beings, and any story that survives tends to survive because it is unusual enough to be remembered, not because it was the most representative. If you want to understand why Churchill's medieval arsenal mattered, think less about the weapons and more about what the weapons did to human minds. Modern armies train to fight modern threats. They drill responses until the body reacts without thought. But when something happens that doesn't fit training, when a battlefield suddenly looks like it belongs to another century, the mind stalls. And the stall is where fear lives. Fear is not only panic. Fear is also confusion. Fear is the moment your brain tries to label reality and can't. In that moment, the enemy has you, even if only for a second. That second is the difference between raising a rifle and being too late. It is the difference between resisting and surrendering. It is the difference between an organized defense and a position collapsing into chaos. Churchill weaponized that second. And in a war where technology was supposed to make everything impersonal, he forced combat to become personal again. A sword is not just a blade. It is a message. I'm close enough to look you in the eye. Bagpipes are not just music. They are a declaration. We are here, and we are not afraid to be seen. A longbow is not just a projectile weapon. It is a reminder that death does not need to be loud to be final. Now, quick break in the story. If you're enjoying this style of long documentary storytelling, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the simplest way to support these deep dives, and it tells the algorithm that long-form history still has a place on your feed. And if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Now let's finish the story properly, because the uncomfortable question remains. Was Churchill a genius of psychological warfare, or a man who couldn't exist without chaos? The answer can be both. People are complicated. War makes them more complicated. Churchill's story is often told as if he was immune to the reality around him, as if he walked through bullets with a grin and a tune. But anyone who has lived through combat will tell you something simple. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is functioning while fear is present. It is doing what you decided to do anyway. It is the ability to keep moving even when your body is screaming that it wants to live. In France, courage meant not collapsing during retreat, not letting panic tear your unit apart. In Norway, courage meant stepping into freezing water under fire, knowing the sea could kill you as quickly as a bullet. In Italy, courage meant holding ground, while artillery rained down and sleep became a rumor. In Yugoslavia, courage meant operating in a brutal landscape where the war didn't have clean edges. In captivity, courage meant refusing to let time hollow you into obedience. If you want a single image to carry away from this story, don't make it the bow or the sword. Make it a different image. A man walking. A man who keeps walking when the world tells him to stop. Walking away from beaches under bombs. Walking into raids. Walking through mountains after imprisonment. Walking through chaos with calm on his face because calm is contagious and panic is deadly. War tries to reduce people into statistics. It tries to make lives interchangeable. It succeeds most of the time. And then sometimes, rarely, one person becomes a story large enough to resist being flattened. Not because he was the most important soldier of the war, but because he was strange enough to be remembered, and because his strangeness illuminates something true about all combat. The human mind is always part of the battlefield. Even in the age of tanks, the oldest weapon in war is still fear, and the oldest defense is still resolve. Churchill didn't win the war. He didn't rewrite grand strategy. He wasn't the most decorated hero in the Allied ranks. What he did was smaller and, in a way, more haunting. He proved that in a world obsessed with modernity, ancient instincts still decide life and death. He proved that technology doesn't erase psychology, it amplifies it. And he proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to an enemy isn't outgun them. It's confuse them, shock them, and make them hesitate. And if that sounds like a clever trick, remember what it cost. Every time a soldier hesitates and dies, there's a family somewhere that receives a letter and a folded flag and a sentence about honor that can't fill the absence at the dinner table. Every time a raid succeeds, there are names carved into memory. Men who didn't make it back to the boats. Every time someone escapes a camp, There are hundreds who couldn't. The story you remember is the survivor's story. The background is a field of silence made of everyone else. That's the part most videos don't linger on long enough, because it hurts to linger there. But if you want to tell WW2 history with honesty, you have to let that hurt exist in the narration. You have to let the viewer feel that the cool moments were built on suffering, and that laughter at the eccentricities sits on top of graves. So when you hear that Jack Churchill carried a medieval longbow into World War II, don't just picture a quirky man with a hobby. Picture the world that made that choice make sense. A world where soldiers were being hunted by aircraft, crushed by armor, exhausted by retreat, and forced to cling to any edge, any advantage, any psychological lever that might keep them alive for one more hour. Picture the thin line between order and panic, and how quickly it disappears when expectations break. Then picture a German soldier on a foggy morning, trained for bullets, suddenly confronted with a death that arrives without sound. Picture the moment his companions pause, not because they are weak, but because they are human, and how in war, being human for even 1 second can kill you. That is the real story. And it is why Mad Jack endures as a legend. Not because medieval weapons beat modern weapons in a technical sense, but because the oldest battlefield is still inside the skull. The moment you control the enemy's mind, even briefly, you can change what happens next. If this story gripped you, do me a favor. Subscribe for more WW2 documentaries and drop a comment with your take. Was Mad Jack a master of psychological warfare, or just a man who refused to live by anyone else's idea of normal? And if you have family history connected to the war, share what you're comfortable sharing, because memory is how these lives avoid disappearing into silence.